We should be the carriers of confidence. Real show is about to begin.
Thank you very much. The first thing I'd like to say is thank you for the invitation. It's a great privilege to be here, and it's very much in the spirit that Shafir mentioned, the importance of debate and respectful engagement. In my tradition, in the Western tradition of philosophy, this goes back to Socrates, and Socrates annoyed everybody because he asked questions, and he got into big trouble for that. But that's the spirit in which I've enjoyed these debates, and I think this is a very important evening. I'm just trying to look for the controller of my slides. I take it I just hit one of these buttons here. Look, the first thing I should say, I prepared my talk without having heard Shafir's remarks, and I feel like jumping in and answering specifically some of the things he said, but we'll come back to that and we'll have the chance to engage with each other. But one of the things I'd like to say before I begin, or two things. One is I've got too many slides. So you're going to have to forgive me. I'm going to skip through a lot of them, which are not entirely relevant given what Shafir has said. The other thing is that one of the key points I want to make is that I entirely agree with one way in which Shafir has framed the discussion, and that is to make an appeal to science. I think that's the right approach, and I want to show how if you do that consistently, you come to a slightly different conclusion than the one that Shafir wants to draw from the way he presents the science. So let me just use my slides to give me a bit of structure. This is the kind of structure that the talk would have, except I'm going to skip through a lot of it. I do want to start off with making an important distinction, as pleasingly has been mentioned. While I share the, what you might call the theological or the scientific point of view of the new atheists, I'm very cross, you might say. I'm very offended by the way in which they've used their atheism as an excuse, not only to criticize other religions, but particularly Islam. And I think this is a grotesque, not only unfairness, it's a part of a very serious political condemnation and demonization of Muslims in the world, which has very serious consequences. And I think it's very important for people like me to stand up and distinguish ourselves from those. Thank you. I'll actually go to some of my slides, but I'm going to skip over those. This is obviously not the audience where I need to say this. It's the sort of things that I want to say, obviously, to a non-Muslim audience that need to hear this, who are arrogant in their conviction that their atheism justifies this kind of stuff. So I'll skip over those, but I have a bunch of slides which I do use elsewhere, and I'm anxious always to present those. These are the guys, and I do want to say something about it to indicate why I'm critical of them in particular. These are the books that have become very famous, and the worst of them is the Sam Harris book. It's really appalling. He says that we're at war with Islam, and it's primary in explaining the rise of fanaticism and the cult of death. Now, you will have heard that phrase endlessly from our Prime Minister, which tells you how these terms from the highbrow intellectuals becomes corrupted and becomes used as a weapon, a political weapon. He didn't make it up. It comes from these highbrow smart guys who are the intellectuals. I won't read through it all, and I'll skip over this. This is really to remind me that one of the main culprits in political life are the educated people, the smart people like Dawkins, Hitchens, and Harris. They fall into a trap that is part of being well educated. They become deeply indoctrinated in certain kinds of prejudices. And the reason they're interesting is because they're the smart guys. They're the guys that are really deeply learned in their science, and I'll show you a couple of slides in a minute. But they're guilty of what was famously argued by one of my great heroes. It was the Palestinian scholar and intellectual Edward Said, who wrote about Orientalism, which was this intellectual distortion of Islam and Arab culture, and in particular in the media. Already in 1981 he wrote the book Covering Islam, which was a long time ago, and he was already indicating the terrible extent to which Islam and Muslims are vilified and denounced. So, as I say, I know that I don't need to explain this to you here, but I feel like giving this lecture repeatedly. One of the things about these guys that is very important is that you notice that they say things like, our principles are not faith, we respect free inquiry, test all things. My criticism of them is that these guys claim to be committed to the facts and to the evidence. And if you know anything about modern history and modern politics, the vast crimes and the extent of mayhem and death in the world is caused by, not by the Muslims, but by the West, by America, by Australia, by people in Washington and elsewhere. Again, I don't have to convince you of this, but this is the sort of lesson that is really quite surprising to people. And there's books written, one called The Rogue State, which shows how much death and murder the United States has been responsible for, and it's not the Muslims, and it's not even Christians, it's not religious at all, it's driven by politics. Anyway, I'm going to skip over this. I've got a lot to say, but again, I know that this is not where to talk about it. I couldn't resist putting that up here recently. I've been very involved in the politics of Palestine, and most people in the public haven't seen what we, the non-Muslims in the world, are doing to innocent civilians. That's Gaza. I'm very closely involved in the Palestine advocacy movement. Let me go to theology. I've got a lot more to say. I've written an article, I should say. If you're interested, you should get in touch either through the organisers or directly. I can send you an article on the politics of these new atheists and why they're so corrupt and so pernicious. That's a whole different story. Let me jump over a bunch of stuff that I had to talk about. You know why that's there. Maybe I better, since you've laughed, I better go back to it. I was going to say that the problem is very much the kind of group mentality, groupthink in psychology. I study psychology, it's one of my areas. And we're all prone to belonging to groups and then losing our critical ability to think outside of the group's views. We're all guilty of this, and what we should learn to do is to be skeptical and critical, and it's very hard, and it's not an accident that Abbott used the word Team Australia, because if you all follow a football team, that's where you learn the reflexes of patriotism and belonging, and it's meant to be a virtue, but it's dangerous because you end up looking like an idiot. And that's why this slide was here, because that's what you end up with. Anyway, I skipped over that, but that's an important point that I often make, because we have to learn that our group belonging, as Edward Said very eloquently said, he was a Palestinian and a committed Palestinian. He said, it's very important to belong to your group. We care about our culture and our history, but you must also be able to transcend your culture to recognize the humanity of other people. That's very hard for everybody to do. So that's why this is here. And I think we all agree in the abstract. In practice, it's very hard for us to do. So anyway. Now, let me jump to the, I was going to give a little lesson on science. I can't help it. I teach philosophy, and I was going to give you my whole semester on the history of science. But since Sharif introduced science, one of the lessons that I give, the Western scientific tradition began in ancient Greece with the pre-Socratics. And previously, they had believed in the gods on Olympus, the Greek gods. And this is why this story is very important, because something happened in ancient Greece in about 600 BC, which changed and led to modern science. It was what the philosophers and the historians describe as the critical spirit. They started questioning what had been taken for granted, and which in those days was the gods, the theology, the religion at the time. So that's my lesson in one sentence or two of the history of philosophy. There's one account of it by a famous philosopher. He says, the last sentence, the tradition of critical discussion was important. Now that's what we're engaged in here tonight, and that's why I think this is very important. This is how we learn to think critically, by engaging actually with people who disagree with you. I teach a course on Galileo, which was a very famous episode in the history of science. He got into trouble with the church at the time, the Catholic Church, for issues which are very similar here. He was challenging not directly the Christian beliefs, but he was showing that they can't be inconsistent with what science tells us. That's why this is very relevant here. In my class on Galileo, I try to show, and I have a passage from Galileo, I won't go through all of this, but there's a passage that Galileo wrote, which is very relevant here as well. It was a letter to the Grand Duchess's mother, the Grand Duke's mother, Christina. He said, God reveals himself to us no less excellently in the effects of nature than in the sacred words of Scripture. This will apply to Muslims and the Holy Quran as well. He says, the Holy Ghost tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. He's teaching the Catholic Church that you shouldn't take the Holy Scriptures as a scientific guide. Now that's why that's relevant to the differences that I think we have with Sharif about how to deal with the science in relation to our faith. And he says it very eloquently. He says, I do not think that one has to believe that the same God who has given us senses, language, and intellect would want us to set aside the use of these so that we would deny our sense and reason. In other words, if our science tells us certain things, as I think it does, which is inconsistent with our religious beliefs, we have to find a way to reconcile them. And that's what the Catholic Church took them a long time, I have to tell you, but 400 years later they agreed with Galileo. Now, let me go through some of the arguments. I'm going to skip over a bunch, but I want to say one thing about the burden of proof. Often before I get involved in a debate like this, one of the issues is who has to prove their position? Should the atheist or should the believer? Now, in fact, it's an important issue, but I'm going to show you, I'll jump ahead to the slides. I've got a number of arguments for God that I will try to mention, at least some of them, and then I'll come back to this burden of proof because it is important. These are the arguments that I typically go through with my students, largely from the Christian tradition, but many of the arguments are also shared by the Islamic tradition. There's the particular one in red there, the first cause or the Big Bang argument we've heard Sharif talk about, and I'll come back to that. But there's a design argument and arguments about evil and morality. One of the questions we didn't raise, but I often in these contexts raise the question, where does your ethics come from and what's the meaning of your life if you don't believe in a God? You may be interested in my answer to that, which is different from yours. Now, William Lane Craig, who's a big shot Christian theologian I've debated with, he suggests that atheists have tried to prove that God doesn't exist. That's a mistake. And he says that I, as an atheist, ought to be agnostic. Well, I'm trying to explain why not. Bertrand Russell, a famous atheist, said he doesn't pretend to be able to prove that there's no God. I don't claim I prove that God doesn't exist, at least in a certain sense. I think there is a proof, and in shorthand, the shorthand version of it is science doesn't tell us that there's a God. My shorthand version of my view is that I believe what's ever in the science textbook. Now, Sharif wants to draw conclusions, but he goes beyond what science permits. That's the key. Now, I want to show you something that is one way of making my point very dramatically, I think, or briefly. You're all atheists. And the reason I suggest this is, if I did a class quiz, we can't do it properly here, if I asked you whether you're a believer or agnostic or atheist, you're going to answer atheist to the next few questions. Do you believe in the Greek gods on Olympus? Hands up who do. I'd be surprised. There's always somebody puts their hand up. I knew. Anybody believe in the Persian god of Zarathustra? He's going to put his hand up again, probably. Or my favorite god is the Mexican god Quetzalcoatl. Well, now, you see, the reason I do this is it's a rhetorical move, but it's important to understand. You don't need to disprove the existence of any of these because you don't believe them. You're not agnostic, you don't suspend judgment, you understand why you don't believe, or at least you expect the person who believes to give you an argument. Now, Sharif has, and I don't feel the obligation to prove that God does not exist. I claim that the justification for it is the same one that you have. There's no evidence for it. The best science doesn't give you any grounds to believe in it, and therefore you're entitled to disbelieve it like you disbelieve a whole lot of other things that you think haven't got any basis. So let's talk about the Big Bang argument a little bit. I'm inclined to do this without my slides because I'm going to go on for too long. The classical form of the argument is God as a first cause, and many philosophers have seen this as confirming their religious beliefs. I'm trying to avoid using all of my slides, but one of the people who debate about this, one philosopher, says the fact of the matter, and he's just stating what the science says in his debates with people like Craig, who essentially take Sharif's view that there's this sequence of causes that goes backwards, and there's this dependency that Sharif described it. It's true, but the science doesn't allow you to take one step beyond the singularity. Science doesn't give you any justification, and so what Sharif is doing something which many of the theologians do, which actually is not kind of fair. He's asking you, can you imagine in your common sense understanding that there could be a beginning out of nothing, whatever physics says? The only view that you're entitled to take is whatever science says, and it's very counterintuitive. It says things you cannot imagine, and you shouldn't then interpose things that you depend on your own judgment to add to the science. Quentin Smith puts it very dramatically. The fact of the matter is that the most reasonable belief is we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing, whatever the nothing exactly is. Now, I should say quickly while I think of it, Sharif makes the point in the service of, let's say, Islam, as do the Christians in favor of their beliefs, even if there's some version of the beginning that was a cause, however you describe it, I think Sharif may have conceded this, you can't derive the Islamic faith from that, you can't derive Christianity from that. You've got something that happened, and the best account of that is whatever science tells us. So the religious doctrines can't get their faiths and their entire edifice of their scriptures from the fact that science tells us something happened, and the best account of that is, as I say, is you have to know relativity theory, you have to know quantum physics, and you have to have a PhD at least to understand these issues. So I'm a bit reluctant to go too far into what the implications are. I've got a very simple story. If it's in the science textbooks and the science journals, then I believe it. And that's what we should all do, because that's the rational approach to belief. Can you imagine that empty space is curved? What the hell does that mean? You have no idea. So you have to read Einstein's theory because it tells you some completely bizarre stuff. Quantum physics is beyond imagination. I mean, literally. And a famous physicist says, don't try and imagine it, just do the mathematics. The world always turns out like these wonderful mathematical models. Now, you can't imagine it. So the best thing we can do intellectually, if we're concerned with rational belief, is to simply do and take our science seriously and literally. So the principle that something can come out of nothing, says this theologian, which is essentially the same argument here, William Lane Craig, he says he rejects it because it's a metaphysical first principle. Sharif didn't use that word, but he's appealing to some principle, and my question is, what does that mean? Where did you get it from? You made it up, because science doesn't allow that. This is a fudge on the part of William Lane Craig. He says it's metaphysically absurd, and if you press him, what does he mean? He's sort of cheating. He says something must have caused the Big Bang, but when you press him, as I've done, he knows perfectly well that you can't talk about causes as we ordinarily understand that, because science doesn't allow causes of the singularity as we ordinarily understand event causation. Now, this is a slightly technical point, but it's simply pointing out that you can't appeal to your intuitions and what you, in common sense, understand about causes when it comes to the Big Bang and the singularity. Whatever physics says, and if it says that 13.5 billion years ago it came out of, I don't know, some quantum fluctuations in the vacuum, I don't know what it means, but that's what I believe. And that's the only thing that's justified. So that's the short version. And so I'll skip beyond that. Now, of course, Van Inwagen, another very big shot philosopher who knows his philosophy, knows his science, he says it's just nonsense and it's just playing with words. That's actually not a very respectable thing for this philosopher to say. He should know better. It's not just words played, word games with the word nothing. I'll skip over some of this stuff because it really is just elaborating the same point. We have to defer to science. How much have I got? 5. Okay, thank you. Look, I'll skip across my slides, which I wish I could spend a lot more time on. Let me raise, this is just jokey slides I show my students. Einstein is talking to a big physicist, Heisenberg there. Now, the relevant connection here is a philosopher called David Hume, who says in a famous essay of his on miracles, it's essentially a version of what I've been saying. He says that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, and in such conclusions as are founded on infallible experience, meaning our science, our laws of nature. In those cases, you expect events to happen in correspondence to the last degree. And you regard your experience and the body of science as your full proof. There is nowhere else to go. Instead of showing my slides, let me address then one way in which Sharif made this point, and I wanted to address that directly. He talked about the senses and how you might make inferences. He gave the example of Mona Lisa and how you can go beyond that. Science goes well beyond the senses. It's been long the case that we talk about things that are not observable directly. Atoms, hadrons, quarks, fields. Physics is full of stuff you can't see. It's much more sophisticated than just what you can see. But that's because it does, in fact, in the way that I think Sharif was talking about, considering the implications of our evidence. And these are the most extraordinary theories about now, not just the beginning of the universe, but atoms and the structure of atoms, and a lot of stuff which is not observable. So you shouldn't criticize people like me, let's say, on the grounds that they only take what you can see, because our science is now well beyond that. Let me go ahead. Einstein, of course, let me say something about the way the Big Bang is to be understood. When I asked you whether you can imagine whether empty space is curved, the textbooks always show it like this, like a trampoline. This is to help you imagine what you can't imagine. And the theory, Einstein's theory, tells you that, in fact, empty space is curved, straight lines bend near the vicinity of heavy masses. This led to the prediction that there would be, when there's a very bad curvature, a very steep curvature, to black holes. They didn't observe it. Einstein's theory predicted this long before there was any observation. And in fact, increasingly, we're starting to see that straight lines and the direction that light goes is distorted by the shape of space. And this led to the kinds of theories, you might imagine it like this, that empty space and straight lines, light gets bent. It was also confirmed later when we found, through telescopic observations, some of those images are two sides or two images that have been refracted of the same system that have been refracted around a heavy object. Now, these are observations that confirm the curvature of space. The reason I'm saying this is because with observations we found from the starlight and Hubble, the light from the stars turned out to prove that the galaxies, the universe, are receding from us at a very great speed. The whole universe is expanding. And this is really just filling in the Big Bang story. Various observations of the background radiation showed that the universe could be imagined not as a balloon, but as the surface of the balloon. People ask what it means for the universe to be expanding. It's not expanding into anything. There is nowhere outside. And in particular, there's no body outside. There's just what physics tells us. So what does it mean to say it came out of nothing? Here's the best analogy I have for what we mean in physics. If you know the mathematics, and you know Einstein's relativity theory and what empty space is when it's curved, the singularity, you can imagine if you try, as the mathematics of the surface of the Earth. If I ask you, what is further north than the North Pole? I always ask this question, and somebody always gives a funny answer. If I was in the classroom, I'd let you think about this a little bit, and I'd take a show of hands. There is no further north. Somebody often always says straight up. Well, that's not further north. That's a silly answer. Sorry if anybody was going to say that. There is no further north. What does that mean? How can there be no further north? That's just the geometry of it. This is the best analogy to what our physics is telling us. The universe began, as best we understand it, somehow like this. I can't imagine it. I don't get it. As I say, if science said it, then that's what I think we have to believe. And anything further than that, you're kind of just relying on intuition or common sense or a tradition which is not from science itself. So I'll end on that. Thank you.